February 24, 2022. Moscow promised a quick and uncontested victory. But 3 years have passed, and the result is devastating. Only 20% of Ukraine occupied, nearly 1 million dead and wounded, and an economy in free fall. While propaganda tries to hide the reality, the facts reveal a country trapped in a dead end. When Moscow promised victory in just 3 days, the image projected was that of an unstoppable force. But the reality on the battlefield tells a different story. A conquest, moving at a snail's pace. According to the Institute for the Study of War, in the past year, Russia managed to capture only 4,200 square kilometers. Proportionally, it amounts to only 0.6% of Ukrainian territory. According to Forbes, in April 2025, Russia's monthly advance was only 68 square miles, a negligible gain given the scale of the conflict. This pace clearly shows how the offensive has lost momentum. At this rate, Russia would need 230 years to occupy all of Ukraine. Yes, more than 2 centuries. And the human cost would be even more absurd. 100 million casualties, which corresponds to nearly 70% of Russia's current population. These numbers do not represent a coherent military strategy, but rather the proof of total stagnation. Instead of conquering, Moscow is merely dragging its soldiers into an endless meat grinder. This is the true face of the so-called special operation, an empire that promised to dominate in days but is now bleeding slowly in a war with no prospect of victory. If territorial numbers already reveal the scale of this stagnation, the real shock comes when we look at the human cost of this war. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, Russian casualties have already surpassed 975,000 dead and wounded. Even more conservative estimates, such as those from the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense, place this number at over 750,000. To understand the magnitude, just compare it to Afghanistan. In 10 years of war, the Soviet Union lost about 15,000 soldiers. Today, in just over 3 years of invading Ukraine, the losses are more than 60 times greater. It is a bloodbath without precedent in modern Russian military history. And the impact goes far beyond the front lines. This bleeding is happening in a country that was already facing a severe demographic crisis since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia's birth rate is among the lowest in the world, unable to naturally replenish its population. As if that were not enough, the war triggered a mass exodus of citizens. It is estimated that around 920,000 Russians left the country just to escape forced conscription. Between the dead, the wounded, and those who fled, nearly 2 million men of working age have been ripped away from society and the economy. That means fewer workers, less innovation, and less capacity to sustain the war machine. The Kremlin is literally burning its own future on the battlefield. Russia is running out of men to throw into this meat grinder. Every month of war not only destroys lives, but irreversibly corrodes the demographic and economic foundation of the entire country. When Putin ordered the invasion, confidence was so high that Russian tanks crossed the border carrying even parade uniforms, ready for a victory march in Kiev. The expectation was minimal resistance, a swift and triumphant advance. But reality turned out very different. According to analyses from CSIS and EFRI, the Russian plan became the greatest intelligence failure of the 21st century. Logistics were designed for a short war and collapsed within the very first days. The most iconic example was the 40-mile column of tanks stalled for weeks outside Kiev, immobilized by a lack of fuel, maintenance, and coordination. What the battlefield revealed was a paper army. Russia failed to secure air superiority, lost thousands of armored vehicles, and saw elite units wiped out. This forced Moscow to resort to desperate measures, drafting poorly trained conscripts, releasing prisoners to fight on the front lines, and hiring mercenaries en masse to try to fill the gaps. And when the strain reached its modern arsenal, Moscow had to turn to the past. Today, we see more and more T-62 and even T-55 tanks being sent to the front, true museum pieces, incapable of competing on a modern battlefield. The image of the world's second-largest military power crumbled under a mix of arrogance, improvisation, and obsolete equipment. Instead of an unstoppable war machine, what Russia showed the world was an army incapable of sustaining its own narrative of power. On the battlefield, Russia already shows clear signs of weakness, and the economic front only reinforces that reality. Moscow now lives under a true war economy, where practically all state resources are directed towards sustaining the conflict. According to the investigative outlet Medusa, 40% of Russia's entire federal budget already goes to defense spending, an enormous figure that reveals not only the military priority, but also the unsustainable cost of that choice. The country is literally cannibalizing public services, healthcare, education, and infrastructure to finance the war machine. And not everything is transparent. Roughly 1/3 of those expenditures are listed as secret projects, with no oversight whatsoever. In other words, beyond draining essential resources, Russia's military budget hides figures that even its own population cannot scrutinize. The result is a silent collapse. International sanctions have devastated high-tech sectors, blocked supply chains, and paralyzed much of the banking system. Western companies have left the country, cutting access to innovation and capital. Russia's main source of revenue, energy, has also gone into decline. Europe drastically reduced its dependence on Russian gas and oil, forcing Moscow to search for new buyers. But the alternative comes at a steep price, selling oil and gas at massive discounts to China and India. In practice, Russia is trading a strategic partnership with Europe based on interdependence for an unequal relationship with Beijing. Today, Moscow is no longer an equal partner, but a vulnerable supplier increasingly dependent on Chinese decisions. The Russian economy is not only bleeding, it is locking itself into a model that condemns it to fragility. While propaganda insists on projecting strength, the numbers reveal a country sacrificing its present and surrendering its future in exchange for an empire that will never come. After so much time, Moscow now finds itself trapped in a no-win game. The options on the table are clear, and all of them are unviable. The first would be nuclear escalation, but that card, always used as a threat, would in practice be suicide. Any use of nuclear weapons would provoke a direct NATO response, turning Russia into the target of the largest military alliance on the planet. On top of that, it would destroy precisely the territory Putin claims he wants to conquer and control. The second option would be a full withdrawal, but that would amount to a devastating political humiliation, something that could open the door to the collapse of Putin's own regime in Moscow. The third alternative, a negotiated peace agreement, also seems out of reach. Ukraine demands the full restoration of its territory, while Russia insists on the legitimization of the areas it has already occupied. These are mutually exclusive positions. In other words, there is no diplomatic way out under the current logic. In short, Putin has dug himself into a trap. Whichever path he chooses could mean the end of his narrative, his strategy, and even his power. Before the war, NATO was seen by many analysts as an alliance, in search of a purpose, weakened and divided. But the invasion of Ukraine brought exactly the opposite, an unprecedented revitalization. The alliance not only united around a common goal, but also expanded. The entry of Finland and Sweden doubled NATO's land border with Russia, further increasing strategic pressure on Moscow. In addition, countries that once hesitated to invest in defense opened their treasuries. Germany raised its military spending to levels unseen since the Cold War, while Poland became one of the strongest armies in Europe, acquiring hundreds of tanks, air defense systems, and next-generation fighters. In the end, the invasion that was supposed to weaken the West ended up strengthening it. Russia is not only bleeding on the battlefield and in its economy, but also now faces a NATO that is stronger and more determined than ever. 3 years after the invasion, the picture is clear. On the battlefield, Russia has achieved only minimal gains, incapable of changing the course of the war. On the human side, nearly 1 million casualties have turned the army into a meat grinder, corroding the very demographic foundation of the country. In the economy, 40% of the federal budget burned on defense. Sanctions destroying entire sectors and a growing dependence on China reveal a silent collapse. And on the international stage, Russia achieved the exact opposite of what it wanted. It strengthened and expanded NATO. The root of this disaster lies in a centralized and authoritarian system that became a hostage of its own propaganda. A regime that believed in its narrative of absolute power, but now can no longer see the reality in front of it. The truth is that Russia is not winning the war in Ukraine. It is trapped in a disaster that threatens not only its imperial ambitions, but its very existence as a power. And the big question that remains is not whether Ukraine will survive. Ukraine has already proven its resilience. The real question is, will Russia itself survive the consequences of Putin's choices? If you want to keep up with the latest updates and analyses on this ever-changing scenario, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss any of the upcoming videos on the military and geopolitical world.